Victoria's breath came in rapid, shallow gasps as she ran through the dense forest, the cold night air biting at her skin. The moon was full, casting an eerie glow on the path ahead, but it didn't comfort her. Every snap of a twig beneath her feet echoed in the silence. Too loud, too noticeable. She was being hunted. It all started when her brother, Michael, disappeared. They had found signs of struggle near their home, the remnants of what could only be a vampire attack. Victoria had tried to tell the authorities, but no one believed her. The stories about vampires were dismissed as myths, old legends. But she knew better. She had to find Michael, and to do that, she had to go where no one else dared to venture. The world of the vampires. She didn't know how it happened, but after weeks of searching and following whispers in dark corners, Victoria had discovered a hidden rift, a crack in reality that led to a parallel world, a place where vampires roamed freely, untouched by human laws, a place that might hold the answers she sought. Suddenly, she heard it, a low growl, followed by a rush of wind. Her heart skipped a beat. The vampire was close. She could feel the cold, predatory presence, but she dared not look back. There was no time for fear, only survival. Her feet carried her faster, the ground beneath her trembling as if the very earth sensed her desperation. And then, through the trees, she saw it. A shimmering tear in the air. The rift. It glowed faintly, beckoning her. Without thinking, she ran toward it, diving into the tear just as a shadow lunged from behind. Victoria's body collided with the strange force of the rift, and she was immediately thrown into a new world. The moment she passed through, the air felt heavier, the scents sharper. The moon above was different, darker, its light cold and distant. The forest around her was vast, stretching endlessly in all directions. She stumbled, disoriented. The ground beneath her was uneven, the sky above unfamiliar. Everything felt wrong. This wasn't the world she knew. It was a place where shadows seemed to move on their own, where the wind carried whispers and languages she didn't understand. From the darkness, a voice cut through the silence, low and menacing. "You shouldn't be here, human." Victoria spun around, her heart thudding in her chest. The figure before her was tall, clad in dark clothing that seemed to blend with the night. His eyes, glowing a fiery red, locked onto hers. A vampire, she knew immediately. "Where is my brother?" she demanded, stepping forward despite the fear gnawing at her. "Tell me where he is." The vampire smirked, his lips curling into a cruel smile. "Your brother? He's not here, not anymore. And if you wish to find him, you'll have to pay the price." Victoria clenched her fists, every muscle in her body tense with anger. She wasn't about to back down. "I will find him. Tell me what I need to do." The vampire's smile widened. "There are many paths in this world, and not all of them lead to safety. But you've already made your choice, haven't you? You've crossed over into our domain. Now you belong to us." Before Victoria could respond, a figure appeared from the shadows, moving with inhuman speed. It was a man, someone she knew. Ethan, her old friend. "Get away from her," Ethan growled, his voice full of authority. Now, Victoria's heart skipped a beat. Ethan? What was he doing here? And why did he look different? There was something cold in his eyes, something that wasn't there before. The vampire took a step back, his eyes narrowing. "You shouldn't be here either." Ethan raised his hand, and the air seemed to crackle with energy. "This doesn't concern you, vampire. Leave." The vampire hesitated for a moment before disappearing into the shadows, vanishing as quickly as he had appeared. Victoria turned to Ethan, confusion and disbelief written all over her face. "What are you doing here? How did you?" "You shouldn't have come," Ethan interrupted, his voice softer now. "This world, it's not for you. You're not ready." Victoria stood in the eerie silence, her mind racing. She had so many questions, Yet Ethan's expression left little room for answers. His gaze was distant, almost regretful, but there was also a sense of urgency in his movements, as if they were running out of time. "You're here for your brother," he said quietly, his eyes scanning the dark woods around them. "But this world, it's more dangerous than you can imagine, and it's changing. The vampires here aren't like the ones you read about in books. They're older, stronger, and they won't hesitate to take what they want." Victoria could feel the weight of his words pressing down on her. She glanced at the rift behind her, the glowing tear that had brought her here. Her thoughts raced. She couldn't go back. Not without Michael. "Tell me where he is, Ethan," she demanded, trying to mask the fear creeping into her voice. "I need to find him." Ethan looked at her for a long moment, his lips tightening. He shook his head slowly. "I don't know where he is, but I can tell you this, your brother's fate is tied to the power in this world. The vampires, they've been trying to open the gate between our world and theirs for centuries. Your brother, he's part of that plan now." Victoria felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you mean? What do they want with him?" Ethan didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a step closer to her, lowering his voice to a whisper. "There are forces in this world that even the vampires fear. Creatures older than them, creatures that live in the shadows between worlds. And your brother?" He paused, looking away, as if struggling with something he wasn't ready to say. "Your brother might be the key to controlling those forces." The air felt heavier now, thick with the weight of what Ethan had just revealed. Victoria's mind reeled. Her brother, Michael, was he the key to some ancient power? And why had the vampires chosen him? Before she could process any of it, a sudden noise echoed from the forest, sharp and unmistakable. A low growl, the sound of something moving quickly in the dark. Ethan stiffened, his eyes narrowing. "We need to move. Now." Victoria felt her heart race again, the danger now real and pressing. She didn't hesitate. She followed Ethan as he moved swiftly through the trees, his footsteps barely making a sound. The forest seemed to close in around them, the shadows growing deeper with every step. As they moved, Victoria couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. A pair of red eyes glinted in the darkness, and she caught a glimpse of a figure darting between the trees. Too fast to be human. Ethan stopped abruptly, holding up his hand. He turned to her, his expression grim. "They're here. The vampire hunters." Victoria's blood ran cold. Vampire hunters. Were these humans who hunted vampires? Or were they something else? "They've been tracking me for days," Ethan continued. "And now they've found you." Victoria's mind raced as she tried to make sense of everything. Vampire hunters? Was there no one in this world who wasn't dangerous? Ethan moved into the shadows, and Victoria followed his lead, staying close as they crouched behind a thick cluster of trees. She barely dared to breathe. The sounds of footsteps grew louder, and soon she could see them. 3 figures, cloaked in dark robes, their eyes hidden beneath hoods. One of them stopped, holding up a hand. "I feel it," he muttered, his voice low and raspy. "There's another one, a human." The second hunter sniffed the air, his nostrils flaring. "She's here, somewhere." The third hunter stepped forward, drawing a long, silver blade from beneath his cloak. "Find her. We won't let the vampires have their way with her." Victoria's heart pounded in her chest. She had no idea how to escape, but she knew they wouldn't give up until they found her. Ethan, however, seemed unbothered by the threat. He moved silently, drawing a small dagger from his belt. "This way," he whispered urgently, taking her hand and leading her through the trees. The hunters moved closer, and Victoria's blood ran cold. She could feel the pressure mounting, her breath coming quicker. She could almost hear their footsteps now. She wasn't sure how long they could stay hidden. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What do we do? How do we escape?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. His eyes flicked around, calculating. Then, without warning, he yanked Victoria by the arm, pulling her deeper into the forest. He motioned toward a small clearing ahead. "There's a rift. It's our only way out." Victoria's eyes widened. Another rift? Could she even trust it? "They'll never stop hunting you," Ethan said, his voice tense. "The rifts are the only way to hide, but you have to make a choice. Do you want to live, or do you want to die here?" Victoria hesitated for a moment, her thoughts racing. She had come this far. She wasn't going to turn back now. With one last glance over her shoulder, she nodded. "Let's go." They ran toward the clearing, but just as they were about to reach the rift, a shadow darted in front of them, blocking their path. A vampire, taller, stronger, and more menacing than the last one she had seen. Ethan stepped forward, ready to fight, but Victoria could feel something cold creeping into her chest. The vampire was faster than them. There was no way they could escape. And then, just as the vampire lunged at them, a howl broke through the air, a loud, terrifying sound that seemed to shake the very trees around them. Victoria turned her head, eyes wide in shock. In the distance, a pack of wild wolves appeared, their eyes glowing a fierce yellow. They surrounded the vampire, snarling, their jaws bared. The vampire hesitated for just a moment, and that was all it took. Ethan moved quickly, pulling Victoria through the rift as the wolves attacked. The world shifted again as they stepped through the rift, the familiar forest disappearing behind them. The instant they passed through, Victoria felt a strange weight lift from her chest, and for a moment, everything was still. The wild howls and sounds of the battle faded, leaving her with a profound silence that felt unnatural. They were no longer in the forest. The world around them was vast and dark, with towering trees that stretched impossibly high, their branches thick and gnarled. The air was heavy, thick with an otherworldly presence. It was as if they had stepped into a different dimension, one where time and space were bent, where the laws of nature didn't apply. Victoria looked around, her heart still pounding from the chase. The strange, glowing light from the rift pulsed behind them, casting an eerie glow on the landscape. But this world, it felt wrong, dangerous. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. Ethan, as calm as ever, took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the surroundings. "We're safe for now," he said, though his voice had a trace of doubt that made Victoria's stomach tighten. "But this world isn't kind to strangers. Why are the wolves helping us?" Victoria asked, her voice trembling. "They're not like any wolves I've ever seen." Ethan's lips curled into a slight, bitter smile. "The wolves are ancient creatures of this world, guardians of the boundaries between realms. They're tied to the rifts. When something threatens this world or the human world, they show up to protect it. But it's more than just that." Victoria's eyes widened as she turned to him. "What do you mean?" Ethan paused before answering. "The wolves protect something more than just the rifts. They protect the balance. And sometimes that means they protect people like you. But it's not without a price." Victoria felt a knot tighten in her chest. She didn't have time to process everything. She needed to find Michael, and soon. She knew the vampires would be back, trying to track her down again. Suddenly, she heard something. A low, unsettling growl from the shadows ahead. Victoria froze. A chill ran down her spine. They weren't alone. From the darkness of the trees, a figure emerged. Taller than any human, cloaked in shadow, with eyes that glowed a sickly red. Another vampire, but this one was different, darker, more powerful. The air around him seemed to thrum with dark energy. Victoria took a step back, fear gripping her heart. Ethan raised his hand, signaling for her to stay behind him. His face was set in a hard line. His eyes narrowed in defiance. "Stay back, Victoria. Don't move." The vampire stepped forward, his eyes locking onto Victoria. "You've crossed into our world, human. Do you truly think you can Victoria's mind raced. What was he? He wasn't like the others. There was something older, something ancient in his gaze. Ethan drew a dagger from his belt, his stance defensive. Leave her alone, Varian. This is not your fight. The vampire, Varian, smiled. A cold, malevolent smile that made the air feel colder. This is everyone's fight, Ethan. And you know that better than anyone. His voice dripped with venom as he spoke, each word laced with a chilling promise. She doesn't belong here. She never did. Before Victoria could react, a low growl sounded from behind them. The pack of wolves, their eyes glowing brighter than before, emerged from the shadows once again. They circled Varian, their teeth bared, but the vampire didn't flinch. He seemed almost amused. You think your pack of wild animals can stop me? Varian taunted, his eyes gleaming. I am the ruler of this realm, and you, Ethan, are nothing but a shadow of your former self. Ethan's grip on his dagger tightened. I'm not afraid of you, Varian. This world will not be ruled by creatures like you. Victoria felt a wave of fear wash over her, but she couldn't let it control her. She couldn't just stand there while they fought. Michael was still out there. She had to do something. Suddenly, a sharp howl echoed through the forest. The wolves, now fully riled, lunged at Varian. For a moment, the vampire seemed to hesitate, but then he swiped at the wolves with inhuman speed, knocking one of them aside with a single motion. Ethan rushed forward, his dagger aimed at Varian, but the vampire effortlessly dodged, moving with supernatural speed. Victoria's heart raced. She needed to act. Her hand instinctively went to the small pouch at her side, the one containing the mysterious object her grandfather had given her before he died. She wasn't sure how it worked, but she knew it had to. The old man had spoken of it in cryptic words, telling her it would protect her when the time came. Victoria pulled it out, a small, weathered stone amulet, glowing faintly with an ethereal light. As she held it in her hand, she could feel a pulse of energy course through her, filling her with a strange sense of power. She stepped forward, holding the amulet out in front of her. The moment she did, the forest seemed to shudder, and Varian's expression shifted from amusement to something closer to confusion. What is this? Varian hissed, his voice filled with disbelief. You dare use that against me? Ethan, noticing the change, took advantage of the momentary distraction. He lunged at Varian, forcing the vampire to retreat into the shadows. Victoria's heart pounded as the light from the amulet flickered. You can't stop me, Ethan, Varian sneered, vanishing into the darkness once more. This world will always belong to us. As the vampire disappeared, Victoria felt the weight of his words press down on her. There was still so much she didn't understand about this world, about the vampires, and about her own role in all of it. But one thing was clear. The journey was only just beginning. The silence was deafening after Varian's retreat. Victoria stood in the clearing, the faint light from her grandfather's amulet still glowing in her hand. Her heart was racing, but she couldn't let herself fall apart. Not now. There was too much at stake. Ethan stood a few feet away, watching her carefully. His expression was unreadable, though the tightness in his jaw betrayed his tension. He knew something was coming, something even worse than the vampire who had just left them. You've done it now, Ethan muttered, his voice grim. Varian will return, and he'll bring more with him. Victoria's gaze remained fixed on the spot where Varian had disappeared. She wasn't sure what had happened, why her grandfather's amulet had reacted the way it did, but she knew one thing. It was no coincidence. It had given her a power, a protection that she could use. I don't care, she said, her voice steady despite the fear still swirling inside her. I'm not leaving without Michael. Ethan's eyes softened slightly. He stepped closer, his hand almost reaching for hers, but he stopped himself. I know you're determined, but this world isn't kind. It's ruthless. and you're not prepared for what's coming. We need to find your brother, but we need to be careful." Victoria's thoughts swirled. She was so close, but at the same time, she knew Ethan was right. She wasn't ready for the true dangers lurking in this parallel world. She had to understand more about the vampires here, the forces that had taken Michael, and about the strange, glowing amulet that had saved her. "I need answers, Ethan," she said, looking up at him. "How do we find him? What's the next step?" Ethan nodded, clearly knowing what she was asking. "We need to get to the heart of the forest," he replied. "It's where the rifts are strongest, where the oldest vampires reside. It's also the place where the balance between worlds is maintained. But you can't just walk in. There are guardians there, creatures older than the vampires themselves." A shiver ran down Victoria's spine. She'd heard about such creatures from the local legends back home, but she never thought they were real. Guardians? What kind of creatures? Ethan's eyes darkened. Not all guardians are kind. Some protect, others hunt. It's a gamble, Victoria, but it's our best chance to find your brother. If the vampires are holding him there, we need to get past the guardians. Victoria swallowed, her fear mingling with determination. "We'll do whatever it takes." With a nod, Ethan led the way, moving deeper into the forest. The path ahead was shadowed, and every crack of a twig, every distant rustle, made her more alert. She couldn't afford to let her guard down. She had already crossed one dangerous line by stepping into this world. Now there was no turning back. As they walked, Victoria couldn't help but notice the eerie silence that hung over the place. There were no birds, no sounds of animals stirring in the brush. The world around them was unnervingly still, like it was holding its breath. And then, far off in the distance, she saw something that made her freeze. A flicker of movement, a shadow darting between the trees. Her hand went instinctively to the amulet at her side, its warmth reassuring her, but she knew she couldn't rely on it forever. If Varian had returned, there was no telling how many others he might bring. They needed to reach the heart of the forest, and fast. Ethan glanced over his shoulder, sensing her unease. "We're close. Stay alert." After what seemed like hours of walking through the dense forest, they finally arrived at a clearing. The trees around them were ancient, their trunks wide and twisted, their branches heavy with a dark energy that seemed to pulse through the air. In the center of the clearing stood an enormous stone structure, crumbling yet majestic, its surface covered in ancient symbols. "This is it," Ethan whispered, his voice low, filled with awe. "The heart of the forest." Victoria took a step forward, her eyes scanning the stone structure. It felt ancient, older than anything she had ever seen. The air here was thick, heavy with the weight of centuries of history. The vampires, the guardians, everything was tied to this place. She could feel it. Michael was somewhere nearby. His presence lingered like a whisper in the air. She had to find him. Ethan moved toward the stone structure, placing his hand on one of the symbols. For a moment, nothing happened. But then, the stone began to tremble, a low hum vibrating through the ground beneath their feet. Victoria stepped back, startled. "What is this? What's happening?" Ethan's expression darkened. "The guardians are waking up. They sense us." Before Victoria could respond, the ground beneath them cracked open, revealing a dark, swirling abyss. Figures emerged from the shadows, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Tall, imposing, with twisted features and razor-sharp claws. These were no ordinary creatures. They were guardians of the heart. Victoria's heart pounded in her chest as she backed away, her instincts screaming at her to run. But there was nowhere to go. The guardians were closing in on them, their eyes fixed on her with an unblinking, predatory gaze. "We need to fight," Ethan said, pulling out his dagger. "Stay close, and whatever you do, don't let them touch you." Victoria's heart thudded in her chest as the guardians advanced. Their eyes burned with a supernatural fire, and their claws scraped against the stone, sending a chilling sound through the air. There was no way out. She could feel the weight of their gaze on her, sensing the danger closing in. Ethan's hand tightened around his dagger as he stepped forward, his stance defensive. "Stay behind me," he ordered, his voice commanding but laced with urgency. Victoria nodded, her breath shallow. She gripped the amulet tighter, its faint glow pulsing in time with her heartbeat. The Guardians didn't stop. They kept advancing, their movements slow but deliberate, as if they knew the power they held over them. A deep, gravelly voice echoed through the clearing, its source hard to pinpoint. "The heart does not welcome intruders," the voice hissed. "You trespass in our realm. You shall not leave." Victoria swallowed her fear. "We're not here to harm the heart," she called out, her voice steady despite the terror gripping her. "We're here for someone. My brother. He's being held here by the vampires." The Guardians paused, their eerie silence only broken by the faint rustling of their unnatural movements. One of them stepped forward, his towering figure casting a long shadow across the clearing. His face was a grotesque blend of beast and man, with sharp teeth and glowing jade-green eyes. "Your brother is not here," the creature snarled, "but you will find nothing but death if you continue to seek him." Ethan's eyes narrowed, his grip on his dagger tightening. "Then we'll make our own way." Without warning, the Guardians lunged, their claws extended, sharp as blades, reaching for Ethan and Victoria. The air seemed to warp with the sudden surge of power as they clashed in a flurry of movement. Ethan dodged the first attack, spinning to the side with remarkable speed, and swiped his dagger across the Guardian's outstretched arm. The creature hissed, but the wound closed almost immediately as if its skin healed itself. Another Guardian rushed at Victoria, and she instinctively stepped back, but she wasn't fast enough. The Guardian's hand grabbed her wrist, its grip cold and unyielding. She gasped in pain as the creature's claws pierced her skin. The amulet pulsed violently in her hand, its light flaring brightly. "Let go of her," Ethan shouted, rushing toward them. With a swift motion, he plunged his dagger into the side of the Guardian, but the creature barely flinched. Victoria struggled, her other hand reaching for the amulet as the glow intensified. Suddenly, the Guardian recoiled as if struck by an invisible force. The pulse from the amulet spread out in a wave, pushing the creature back with a force that made the air vibrate. Victoria felt a surge of energy course through her body, like a current of electricity. The Guardian stumbled, its claws releasing their grip on her as it was pushed to the ground, writhing in agony. Victoria took a shaky breath, still trying to comprehend what had just happened. The amulet was glowing even brighter now, its power coursing through her veins. It was more than just a trinket, it was a weapon, a protector. But what else could it do? Before she could think further, another Guardian lunged, this time coming at her with terrifying speed. But Ethan was already there, his dagger flashing through the air, blocking the Guardian's strike just in time. "We have to keep moving," Ethan shouted as the Guardians continued their relentless assault. Victoria nodded, her heart still racing, but she was no longer completely afraid. The amulet had given her strength, a sense of purpose she hadn't felt before. It was clear now that the amulet wasn't just a symbol of protection. It was connected to the very forces that governed this world. And maybe, just maybe, it was the key to finding Michael. As the Guardians regrouped, Ethan grabbed Victoria's arm and pulled her toward the center of the clearing. "This way," he urged, leading her toward a massive stone archway at the heart of the structure. It was surrounded by dark, swirling mist, the air thick with the scent of ancient magic. Victoria hesitated for only a moment before following him, her mind still reeling from the fight. The Guardians were powerful, but they weren't unstoppable, not with the amulet in her hand. They reached the archway, and Ethan motioned for Victoria to step through first. "This is where the rift is strongest," Beyond this point, you'll find what you're looking for. But be careful. The vampires, Varian, especially, they'll do anything to stop you from reaching the truth. Victoria stepped forward, taking one last look at the Guardians, who were now gathering their strength for another attack. She had no choice but to go through. As she passed through the archway, she felt the air grow colder, the world around her shifting once again. But this time, it wasn't a rift to the forest. It was something deeper, something older. She was stepping into the heart of the vampire world. The ground beneath her feet was cold stone, and the air smelled of decay and old blood. The vast, dark expanse stretched out before her, illuminated only by the dim light of flickering torches along the walls. This was where the vampires had made their home, and where Michael was now trapped. Victoria's breath caught in her throat. She was closer than ever to finding him, but the danger had only just begun. Victoria's pulse quickened as she stepped further into the heart of the vampire world. The air here felt dense, heavy with the scent of damp earth and something more sinister. Blood, ancient and old. The stone beneath her feet seemed to hum with a deep, resonating power, as if it had absorbed the echoes of centuries of darkness. Ethan followed closely behind her, his eyes scanning the surroundings with a practiced wariness. His usual calm demeanor had shifted to something more urgent, his every step measured, his hand on the dagger at his belt. He knew the dangers of this place well. Victoria couldn't help but feel the weight of the amulet at her side, its glow now dimming, as though it was reacting to the oppressive presence of the realm. She had to keep going. Michael was somewhere in this labyrinth of stone, held captive by creatures far older and stronger than anything she had encountered. But she would find him. She would save him. Stay close, Ethan murmured, his voice low, his eyes flicking to the dark corridors that stretched endlessly before them. This place is full of traps, and the vampires won't hesitate to use them. They moved forward, the flickering torches casting long shadows on the cold, smooth walls. The hallway twisted and turned, and with every step, the sense of danger grew more pronounced. Victoria's breath quickened as they reached a heavy iron door at the end of the hall. It was ancient, rusted but still sturdy, with symbols carved into its surface. Symbols that seemed to pulse with a faint, dark energy. "This is it," Ethan said quietly, his voice tight. "Beyond this door lies the inner sanctum of the VampireLord. If Michael is anywhere, he's inside." Victoria's heart hammered in her chest. She could feel the faint, familiar tug of connection. Michael's presence, distant but unmistakable. He was close, but as Ethan reached for the door, it creaked open by itself, as if sensing their approach. The sound echoed through the halls, and Victoria froze, her eyes narrowing. Something wasn't right. Before she could react, a low, mocking voice echoed through the chamber. "Welcome, Victoria." The voice sent a shiver down her spine. She recognized it immediately. Varian, the VampireLord, stepped from the shadows, his eyes glowing a deep crimson, his smile cruel and knowing. He was no longer the vampire she had first encountered. Now, he was a figure of pure malice, power radiating from him like a tangible force. "You've come far," Varian continued, his voice laced with dark amusement. "But you're too late." Victoria clenched her fists, stepping forward. "Where is my brother, Varian? I know he's here. I won't leave until I find him." Varian tilted his head, his smile widening. "Your brother is a pawn in a much larger game, Victoria. He always has been, just like you." Ethan's hand tightened on his dagger, but he didn't draw it yet. His voice was tight with warning. "You don't know what you're dealing with, Varian. This isn't just about Michael anymore. It's about more than you can control." Varian chuckled, his laughter echoing around the chamber. "Oh, I know exactly what I'm dealing with, and that's why you'll never leave this place. Not alive." Suddenly, the air shifted, the temperature dropping as if the very atmosphere had turned cold with malice. Dark figures began to emerge from the shadows around them. Vampires, their eyes glowing, their movements unnervingly fast. They surrounded Victoria and Ethan, closing in on them from all sides. "Get ready," Ethan whispered, his voice low but steady. "We're not getting out of here without a fight." Victoria's heart pounded as the vampires advanced, their fangs gleaming in the torchlight. She could feel the amulet pulsing at her side, its energy now crackling with power. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for. She wasn't going to let them take Michael. Not now, not ever. Without thinking, she reached for the amulet, her fingers brushing against its smooth surface. A surge of energy erupted from it, filling her with strength. The air around her shimmered, and before she could fully process what was happening, a blinding light exploded from the amulet, knocking the vampires back and sending them reeling. Varian's eyes narrowed as he watched the light pulse from the amulet. "So it's true," he murmured, his voice dark with realization. "You've awakened its power." Victoria's vision blurred with the intensity of the light, but she held onto the amulet, using its energy to protect herself. The vampire stumbled back, disoriented and weakened by the force of the blast. "Now's our chance," Ethan shouted, his voice breaking through the chaos. He charged forward, slashing at the vampires with his dagger, his movements fluid and fast. Victoria didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, keeping the amulet raised, and with each step, the vampires recoiled. They seemed to fear the power radiating from the amulet, fear it as if it were a weapon of the gods themselves. But even with the power of the amulet, Victoria knew it wouldn't be enough to defeat Varian, not alone. "Michael," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the chaos. "I'm coming for you." Suddenly, a familiar voice echoed through the chamber. "Victoria." Victoria's breath caught in her throat. She turned toward the source of the voice, her heart skipping a beat. There in the shadows stood her brother, Michael, pale, weak, but alive. Victoria's heart pounded in her chest as she turned toward Michael, her brother standing in the shadows, his eyes dull with exhaustion but still unmistakably him. The sight of him was enough to fuel her determination, despite the overwhelming odds stacked against them. "Michael!" she called out, her voice shaking, but filled with raw emotion. She could see the confusion and pain in his eyes, and it nearly shattered her resolve. "Victoria," Michael whispered hoarsely, his voice weak, almost too faint to hear. "You shouldn't have come. You don't know what you're dealing with." The words struck her like a blow, but she couldn't stop now. She had come too far to turn back. "I'm getting you out of here," she said, her voice firm, though her hands trembled. She took a step forward, ignoring the searing cold energy in the air. Varian, still watching from the shadows, smiled wickedly. "So, this is what the amulet can do," he mused, his tone dark and calculating. "But it won't be enough to save you, Victoria. You think you can simply waltz in here, disrupt the balance, and take your brother? The price for defying me is much greater than you realize." Ethan stepped beside her, his eyes narrowed, a fierce resolve in his expression. "You've underestimated her, Varian. She has more power than you know." Varian's gaze shifted to Ethan, his expression darkening. "You, of all people, should know what's at stake here. You're nothing but a shadow of your former self. You abandoned us. Now you return, and you bring this human child with you, thinking you can stop what's already been set into motion." Ethan's expression hardened, but before he could reply, the ground beneath them began to tremble. Victoria gripped the amulet tighter, the energy within it reacting to the disturbance. The chamber around them seemed to groan and shift, as if the very structure of the vampire's stronghold was awakening in response to their presence. Then, the darkness in the corners of the room seemed to deepen, and from it, more figures emerged. Not vampires, but something else. Creatures of shadows and mist, with glowing eyes, claws like daggers, and a predatory presence that made the vampires look tame by comparison. These were the ancients, the beings Varian had summoned to protect the heart of the forest. Their forms flickered between reality and the shadows, moving with unnatural grace. Their cold eyes locked onto Victoria, and she could feel the weight of their gaze, heavy with centuries of hunger. Ethan drew his dagger, stepping in front of her. "We won't let you have her, Varian. This ends tonight." Varian smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You think you can stop me? You're in my domain, and these creatures serve me. You're already dead. You just don't know it yet." Victoria knew she had to act, and fast. The amulet was still glowing brightly, but she could feel its power waning with every passing second. It wasn't a limitless source of strength, but it had already shown its power, enough to push back the vampires, enough to give them a chance to fight. She stepped forward, her voice trembling but steady. "Michael, I'm here for you. I won't let them take you." Michael's eyes flickered with recognition, and for a moment, she saw the brother she knew, the one she had been fighting for. "Victoria, you don't understand," he whispered, stepping out from the shadows, his form weak but defiant. They're using me. They've bound me to this place. I can't." Victoria's breath caught as she reached out to him, her hand shaking. "No, Michael, you're not their prisoner. You're my brother. You're coming with me, no matter what." Varian let out a cold laugh, his voice echoing through the chamber. "You think you can just take him? There's more at stake here than you realize. The blood of your brother, Victoria, it's the key to opening the rifts completely. If you take him, you'll doom both worlds." A chill ran down Victoria's spine, but she didn't hesitate. "I don't care what you think. I won't let you win." The air around her shifted. The amulet pulsed with an intense surge of energy, its light brightening again, forcing the creatures of the shadows back. The vampires recoiled as well, the light from the amulet seeming to weaken their power. Varian snarled, his eyes glowing even more intensely. "So it's come to this then. You won't listen. You'll never understand the consequences of your actions. Very well. If you want your brother, you'll have to go through me." With that, the ground beneath them erupted and the battle began in earnest. The chamber seemed to close in around them as Varian lunged forward, his speed unreal. Ethan moved to intercept, his dagger flashing in the dim light, but Varian was faster. He knocked Ethan aside with a swipe of his hand, sending him crashing into the stone wall. Victoria gritted her teeth, her hand clutching the amulet as she focused its power. A pulse of energy shot from it, pushing back Varian momentarily. But it wasn't enough to stop him completely. The VampireLord advanced, his eyes filled with fury. "You can't stop me, human," Varian hissed, his voice filled with venom. "I am the ruler of this realm." Victoria felt a surge of power from the amulet, but she couldn't control it entirely. The energy was wild, pulsing erratically as though the amulet itself was reacting to the danger surrounding them. In the chaos, she caught a glimpse of Michael, his body trembling as though he was fighting the very bonds that held him to this cursed place. "Michael," she shouted, reaching out for him. But Varian stepped between them, blocking her path. "You think you can save him? The only way out of here is death, Victoria. You should have stayed in your world," Varian sneered, his hand reaching toward her. Victoria raised the amulet high, its light flaring brightly again. "I'm not afraid of you." The light erupted from the amulet with a force that seemed to shake the very foundation of the chamber. Varian staggered back, his hands raised to shield his eyes from the intensity. But it wasn't enough. The guardians of the heart, the creatures of the shadows, began to screech in pain as the light engulfed them. They crumbled away, disintegrating into the air. Varian roared in fury, his form rippling with dark energy, but he couldn't stop the force of the amulet. It was too strong. The rift to the vampire world, the very realm that had been torn between worlds, began to shudder as the amulet's power reached its peak. "Michael!" Victoria shouted again, her voice cracking. She couldn't let this be the end. Victoria's heart pounded as the light from the amulet continued to surge, its power rising with each passing second. The chamber was shaking, the walls cracking from the sheer force of the energy radiating from the amulet. It was almost too much for her to handle, but she didn't care. She had come too far to back down now. Varian, though momentarily disoriented, quickly recovered, his vampire strength allowing him to fight against the force of the light. He raised his hands, his eyes burning with fury, and the shadows in the room swirled violently around him. "You fool," Varian snarled, his voice dark with rage. "You think you can stop me with this little trinket? You have no idea what you're tampering with." Victoria's breath came in shallow gasps as she held the amulet steady, its glow intensifying, but she felt the weight of exhaustion settling in. The energy it was draining from her was immense. She could feel her strength waning, her grip on the amulet growing weaker by the second. Ethan, struggling to regain his footing after being thrown aside earlier, managed to stand, shaking off the dizziness. He saw Victoria's weakening state and rushed to her side, his eyes filled with concern. "Victoria, you have to focus," he called, his voice urgent. "You have to keep the energy flowing, or the amulet will lose its power." Victoria nodded weakly, her hand shaking as she clutched the amulet even tighter. She could feel its power growing faint, but there was no time for hesitation. Michael was still too far away, his body bound to the stone altar at the center of the chamber. The VampireLord was right, she had no idea what she was truly facing. But there was no turning back now. Varian's form shifted once more, his features becoming sharper, more monstrous as his true vampire nature emerged. He stepped forward, his eyes glowing red with malice. "You cannot stop this, Victoria. Your brother is nothing more than a pawn in a game you don't understand. And you," he sneered, "you're just a tool to bring about the end of your world." A tremor of fear washed over Victoria as Varian's words sank in. Her brother, was he really a pawn in some ancient game? What had they done to him? But even as the doubt crept in, her resolve hardened. There was no time to question. She had to save him. Without warning, Varian lunged, moving with such speed that Victoria barely had time to react. The air seemed to crackle with dark energy as Varian's hand shot toward her, his claws outstretched. "No!" Ethan shouted, throwing himself in front of Victoria just in time. The VampireLord's claws raked across Ethan's side, tearing through his flesh. Ethan let out a strangled cry of pain, but didn't falter. He thrust his dagger toward Varian, aiming for the vampire's heart. But Varian sidestepped with supernatural grace, swatting Ethan aside like a ragdoll. Victoria gasped, panic rising in her chest. Ethan was on the ground, clutching his side, blood pooling beneath him. Varian moved closer to Victoria, his eyes gleaming with victory. "Your friend is weak," Varian taunted, his voice dripping with mockery. "Just like you." In that moment, everything seemed to slow down. The world around her blurred, and Victoria's focus shifted entirely to Michael, still chained to the altar. Her brother's eyes met hers, his face pale but filled with recognition. He was still fighting against the chains, still struggling. Victoria's heart twisted. She couldn't lose him, not now, not ever. Then, in a sudden surge of power, the amulet flared to life again. The energy inside it surged up through her, filling her with an unrelenting force. The light it emitted engulfed the room, casting a harsh, blinding glow that sent the vampires recoiling in fear. Varian roared in frustration, his hands raised to shield his eyes. But it was too late. Victoria, fueled by her desperation and love for her brother, threw the full force of the amulet's power forward. The blast of energy was so intense, it shook the walls of the chamber and sent a shockwave through the VampireLord's army. The creatures that had emerged from the shadows shrieked in agony as they dissolved into dust. Varian staggered backward, his face contorted in fury. "You dare!" But before he could finish his sentence, the amulet's light shot forward, striking him directly in the chest. His body trembled under the intense force of the energy, and with a final, pain scream, he crumbled to the ground. Victoria dropped to her knees, the energy leaving her body in a rush, leaving her weak and exhausted. She could barely keep her eyes open, but she forced herself to look at Michael. The chains binding him shattered, breaking apart like brittle glass, and he fell to the ground with a gasp. "Michael," she cried, her voice barely above a whisper. Michael looked up at her, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Victoria? How did you?" Before she could respond, Varian's form began to twitch, his body writhing as if the very essence of his being was being torn apart by the amulet's power. But the VampireLord wasn't dead yet. He was struggling to regenerate, pulling himself up with unnatural determination. Ethan, though injured, stood shakily beside Victoria, his hand on her shoulder for support. "We need to go. Now." But as Varian slowly got to his feet, his eyes glowing with renewed fury, he hissed, "You can't escape me. Not after everything I've done. This is far from over." The moment Victoria saw Michael move, her heart surged with relief. He was alive, and despite the uncertainty, she knew she couldn't waste another second in this cursed place. She helped him to his feet, her hands shaking from the exhaustion of the battle, but there was no time to rest. They had to escape. Ethan, though clearly injured, stepped forward. His eyes were dark with determination as he scanned the room, watching the VampireLord's movements closely. "We don't have much time," he said, his voice strained. "Varian won't stay down for long. We need to leave now, or we'll be trapped here." Victoria nodded, barely able to keep her composure. Michael, now on his feet, looked at her. His eyes filled with confusion, pain, and something else. Guilt. "I'm sorry, Victoria," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I didn't want any of this, but I couldn't escape. They used me. I didn't have a choice." Tears welled in Victoria's eyes as she reached for him, pulling him into an embrace. "You don't need to apologize. You're here now, and we're getting out of here. Together." The sound of Varian's growl from behind them sent a chill through Victoria's spine. He wasn't finished yet. His body was already regenerating, his form slowly rising from the ground, his eyes burning with hatred. "You'll pay for this," Varian spat, his voice low and guttural. "You think you've won, but you've only just begun to see the consequences." Victoria pulled Michael away from the VampireLord, pushing him toward Ethan. "We need to go. Now!" she shouted. Ethan nodded, moving quickly, his dagger still gripped tightly in his hand. "Follow me. Stay close." They rushed toward the far end of the chamber, the only way out. Victoria's heart hammered in her chest as she moved quickly, trying to ignore the pain in her body and the rising tension of the chase. Behind them, Varian's voice echoed, more distant now but still threatening. "You cannot escape what is coming, Victoria. This world will be ours, and you are a part of it now, whether you like it or not." But Victoria didn't listen. She couldn't. They were so close to freedom, and she refused to let him control her or her brother any longer. As they reached the exit, the walls of the chamber began to tremble again. The ground shook beneath them as the very foundations of the stronghold began to collapse. Varian's power was tearing the world around them apart, but it wasn't enough to stop them. Not yet. Ethan reached the door, his hands moving with practiced speed to unseal it. The ancient locks creaked and groaned as they broke apart, but they were too late. Varian appeared behind them in an instant, moving faster than Victoria could react. His hand shot out, grabbing Michael by the throat and slamming him into the stone wall. "No!" Victoria screamed, rushing toward them, but she was too far away. Varian's grip on Michael tightened, his fangs bared in a twisted smile. "You thought you could save him? He's mine, Victoria. You cannot keep what was never yours." Ethan, still holding his side, moved forward, but Varian was too powerful. He threw Michael aside, his body crashing to the ground, barely conscious. With a twisted laugh, Varian stepped back, ready to deliver the final blow. But Victoria wasn't about to let that happen. With everything she had left, she reached for the amulet, her hands shaking with desperation. She held it up to the sky, the amulet glowing brighter than ever before, the energy inside it surging. The ground beneath them trembled again, the air around them vibrating with the intense power of the amulet. Varian's expression faltered for a moment, his eyes widening in disbelief. "No, you don't understand what you're doing." But Victoria didn't hesitate. She thrust the amulet forward, and a beam of brilliant light shot from it, slamming into Varian with an explosion of force. His body was thrown back, his scream echoing through the chamber as he was consumed by the light. For a moment, the room was silent, the air still with the lingering power of the amulet's blast. Victoria lowered the amulet, her body trembling, her heart racing. She had done it. Varian was gone, at least for now. Michael, barely able to move, looked at her with awe. "Victoria, how?" She sank to her knees, her strength completely spent. "I didn't have a choice," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I had to protect you." Ethan, though injured, moved to her side. "You did it, Victoria. You saved him. We can leave now." Victoria nodded weakly, still holding the amulet in her hand. She didn't know how long the peace would last, but for now, they had escaped the worst of it. As they turned to leave, Victoria glanced back at the now-destroyed vampire stronghold. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. No matter what came next, she and Michael would face it together. They stepped through the door and into the unknown, leaving behind the remnants of a world that had nearly consumed them both. Whatever happened next, Victoria knew she had the strength to face it, because she had her family, and they had survived the darkness together. As they stepped away from the crumbling vampire stronghold, the air felt different, cooler, cleaner. Victoria breathed in deeply, her lungs filling with the fresh, crisp air of the outside world. For the first time in what felt like ages, she could breathe without fear. They had escaped, but the weight of what they had just experienced still hung heavy on her shoulders. Michael, still weak but standing on his own, looked around, his expression a mixture of relief and confusion. "Where do we go now?" he asked, his voice low, almost as if he didn't believe they were truly free. Ethan, though injured, managed a small smile, though his eyes still held a grim determination. "We keep moving. The vampire world isn't going to forget what happened here. And Varian's not the only one who wants control of the rifts." Victoria nodded, her gaze turning toward the horizon. The world ahead seemed endless, filled with danger, uncertainty, and the unknown. But for now, they had time, a precious commodity they hadn't had in a long time. "What exactly was the rift?" she asked, her voice filled with curiosity, though she already knew it was something ancient, something tied to both the vampire realm and the human world. Why did they want Michael? Ethan's eyes darkened as he looked at her. "The rift is a doorway between worlds, Victoria. It's been there for centuries, hidden, guarded. The vampires and others have been trying to open it to gain access to both realms. Your brother, he's part of the prophecy that will either open it fully or keep it closed. His blood, his connection to the rift, it's what they were after." Victoria felt her stomach twist at the implications of Ethan's words. Her brother had been a pawn in a much larger game, and she had been so focused on saving him that she hadn't fully understood the significance of what they had been dealing with. "Why didn't you tell me this sooner?" she asked, her voice sharp. "Why didn't you tell me what I was getting into?" Ethan's gaze softened, but there was a sadness in his eyes. "I wanted to protect you. The truth about the rifts, about what's been happening for centuries. It's a dangerous secret, but now that you're in it, there's no going back." Victoria's mind reeled. The rift, Michael's blood, the vampires. It was all part of something much larger than she had imagined. She had always known there was something off about their family, but she never thought it was tied to something as immense as this. "I didn't ask for any of this," she said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else. "I just wanted to save my brother." "You did," Ethan said, his voice low but comforting. "But now, we all have to face the consequences of it." Michael's voice interrupted their conversation. "What happens now, Victoria? Where do we go from here?" Victoria turned to her brother, her heart swelling with a mix of love and worry. She had saved him, but in doing so, had they just unleashed something even worse? For a moment, she was silent, trying to find the right words. "We don't have all the answers, Michael, but we keep moving. We find the next clue, the next step, and we fight to protect the balance between the worlds." Ethan nodded in agreement, his eyes focused on the distant horizon. "There are other factions out there, groups who want control of the rift. Some of them will be after you, Michael. We have to be ready for them." Victoria's hand instinctively went to the amulet at her side, its glow now dimming. It had been a lifeline, something she never knew existed, something that had kept them alive through the darkest moments. But its power felt diminished now, as if it, too, needed time to recover. "We'll be ready," she said, though she knew deep down that the challenges ahead were far from over. There would be no more hiding, no more running. The fight had only just begun. As they moved forward, Victoria took one last glance at the remnants of the vampire stronghold in the distance. It was a symbol of the destruction they had left behind, but also a reminder that there was more to their story, a story that was far from finished. As the trio made their way through the dense forest, Victoria couldn't shake the sense that they were being watched. The trees around them whispered in the wind, and she could feel the presence of something not entirely human. There were other creatures out there. She knew, creatures who had been waiting for the rift to open. Ethan seemed to sense her unease. "Stay alert," he muttered, glancing around. "The vampires may be gone for now, but there are others who want the rift. And there are still old alliances we don't understand." "What do you mean?" Victoria asked, her voice tense. "There are other ancient creatures who watch over the rift. Creatures that are neither fully human nor vampire. They've been here for centuries, guarding the balance. Some want to protect it, but others..." He let his words trail off. Victoria's stomach clenched. The world she had thought she knew was unraveling, revealing layers of power, danger, and secrets she had never imagined. "I don't know what's ahead," she admitted, "but I'm not stopping. We've come too far." Michael gave her a weak smile, his hand resting on her shoulder. "I'm with you. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." And so, they continued on, stepping into the unknown, knowing that the challenges they had faced so far were nothing compared to what awaited them. The path ahead grew more treacherous as they ventured deeper into unfamiliar territory. Victoria, Michael, and Ethan had left the remnants of the vampire stronghold behind, but there was no peace to be found. The rift, its power still pulsing faintly within Michael, loomed over them like an invisible storm. They could feel the tension rising as they pressed forward, unsure of what lay beyond the next horizon. For days, they traveled through dense forests and desolate landscapes, always on edge. Every rustling leaf, every flicker of movement in the distance sent their hearts racing. They were being hunted, and the factions seeking control of the rift were closing in. Ethan, despite his injuries, had become more cautious, his sharp eyes scanning the surroundings constantly. "There are factions in this world who want the rift to remain open, and others who want to close it forever," he explained one evening as they set camp. "We've only seen a small fraction of what's at stake." Victoria, exhausted but determined, sat beside him by the fire. "What exactly are these factions? Why do they want control of the rift?" Ethan hesitated, staring into the flames. "The factions are ancient, older than the vampires. Some are guardians, protectors of the balance, while others are more dangerous. They see the rift as a tool, a weapon. If it's opened fully, the consequences would be catastrophic. Entire worlds would be merged. Vampires would invade the human world. And the power, it would be unimaginable." Victoria's mind raced as she absorbed his words. "So what do we do? How do we stop it from happening?" Ethan met her gaze, his expression dark. "We find the core of the rift and destroy it. But it won't be easy. The guardians of the rift are the only ones who know where the core is hidden, and they won't let anyone interfere without a fight." Victoria's heart sank, but she knew they couldn't turn back now. They had come too far. For her brother, for the world. Their journey eventually brought them to a secluded valley, surrounded by jagged mountains and ancient trees. The air felt thick with magic, and as they ventured further into the valley, they began to sense an undeniable presence, something watching them from the shadows. It was here that they encountered the guardians of the rift, beings unlike any they had faced before. These were not vampires, nor were they human. They were ethereal, their forms shifting between shadow and light, with glowing eyes that seemed to pierce through their very souls. One of them, a tall figure draped in ancient robes, stepped forward. Its voice echoed like 1,000 whispers. "You seek the heart of the rift," it said, its gaze fixed on Victoria. "But you do not understand what you ask. The rift is not a simple weapon to be controlled. It is a force of nature. If you try to destroy it, you risk unraveling the very fabric of reality." Victoria stepped forward, her heart beating faster. "We have no choice. The vampires Varian will destroy everything if they gain control. We can't let that happen." The Guardian's eyes flickered with something akin to pity, but it was gone in an instant. "Then you must prove your worth. If you truly wish to close the rift, you must pass the trials. Only those who are worthy can alter the rift's course." Ethan stepped forward, ready for whatever challenge lay ahead. "What are the trials? We'll face them no matter what." The Guardian nodded, and with a wave of its hand, the ground beneath them began to shift. A stone path emerged, leading into a labyrinth of swirling shadows and light. The trials are not physical. They are tests of will, of heart, and of mind. If you fail, you will never return. Victoria, Michael, and Ethan exchanged determined looks. They had no choice but to proceed. They had come too far. The trials tested them in ways they had never imagined. Each one was a battle not only against external forces, but against their own fears and doubts. For Victoria, the first trial was a vision, an image of her family, her parents, standing before her. They looked just as they had before they were taken from her. But there was something wrong about them. They reached out, calling her name. But with each step she took toward them, they became more distorted, more monstrous. "Come to us, Victoria," they whispered, their voices sweet but chilling. "You belong here. You've always known it. Don't fight it." But Victoria, remembering everything she had fought for, shook her head. "No, I've never belonged to this world. I belong with my brother, and we will stop this madness." With that, the vision shattered, and she was free to continue. Michael's trial was more difficult. He faced a mirror, one that reflected not his own face but Varian's. A cold, emotionless reflection. "You are mine," Varian's image said, its voice filled with dark satisfaction. "You cannot escape your fate. The rift is your destiny. You were always meant to open it." Michael struggled with the vision, his mind battling against the part of him that had been controlled. But Victoria was there, urging him forward, reminding him who he was. "I'm not a pawn," he said, stepping away from the mirror. "I'm my own person. I'm not part of your game." The final trial came for Ethan. He was forced to confront his past, his guilt over the choices he had made. He saw himself younger, making decisions that had led him down the path of betrayal. "You abandoned them," the trial whispered. "You abandoned her." But Ethan's resolve remained. "I can't change the past, but I can make things right. I can protect her now." With the trials complete, they stood before the heart of the rift. The energy was palpable, swirling with immense power, but it was fragile, like a thread on the edge of snapping. Victoria, Michael, and Ethan stood before the heart of the rift, the decision now resting on their shoulders. The Guardian stood behind them, watching in silence. "Destroy it," the Guardian intoned, "and you will close the rift forever. But know this, there will be consequences. The rift is the gateway to both worlds. If it is closed, the worlds will be separated once more, and no one can cross between them. You will never return." Victoria's heart ached. She had come so far. She had fought so hard for this moment. And yet, will we ever see each other again? Michael asked, his voice trembling. Victoria's hand found his, gripping it tightly. "We will make sure the world is safe, Michael. That's what matters most." With one last look at Ethan, she nodded. "We do this together." They raised the amulet together, and with a burst of energy, the rift collapsed in on itself. The worlds began to separate once more, the veil between them thinning and then vanishing altogether. And in that moment, they knew that their fight was over. They had saved their world, but they had also lost the chance to ever return to the other. Years later, Victoria and Michael stood together in a world that had healed from the shadows of the rift. They had rebuilt their lives, free from the dark forces that had once sought to control them. But the memory of the rift and the price they had paid remained. They had won, but the cost was more than they could have ever imagined. As the years passed, the memories of the rift and everything they had gone through began to fade, at least for the world. People moved on, lives resumed, and the quiet return to normalcy began. Yet, for Victoria, Michael, and Ethan, the scars of their journey would never truly heal. Victoria stood on the hill overlooking the valley where the rift had once stood. The place was now quiet, serene, a stark contrast to the chaos that had once consumed it. The winds carried the distant sounds of life, but for her, everything was still. The rift had been closed, the world saved, but something inside her had changed forever. She couldn't shake the weight of the choice she had made. Beside her, Michael stood tall, a young man now, his strength regained, but a quiet sadness lingered in his eyes. They had both lost so much, yet found a way to rebuild what had been broken. "Do you ever wonder what might have happened?" Michael asked softly, his gaze far off, as if searching for an answer in the wind. Victoria smiled softly, though it was tinged with sorrow. "Sometimes, but we made the right choice. The rift was too dangerous. We couldn't let it stay open." Michael nodded, but the question still lingered in his eyes. The world had been saved, but at the cost of their connection to the other realm. The cost of losing the path between the worlds forever. As they stood there, the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the land. The stars would soon appear, and while the world moved on, they knew their story, their battle would never be forgotten. Not by them. They had faced darkness together and emerged stronger, bonded forever by the trials they had endured. Victoria turned toward Michael, her hand resting on his shoulder. "We may never know what truly lies beyond the rift, but we have each other, and that's enough." Michael smiled, a bittersweet expression on his face. "Yeah, it's enough." They watched the sunset together, knowing that while their journey had ended, the legacy of their courage would live on. Because, in the end, they had found what was most important: family, love, and the strength to protect what mattered. And so, the rift faded into history, a chapter closed, with the echoes of their struggle lingering like a whisper in the winds of time.